and I'm chair of the Norwegian BN Norway. Together with Studieforbudet Solidaritet, we would like to ask questions about Norwegian aid. We hear a lot about the aid does not reach those who really need it, whether because the money is spent on administration or because they end up in pockets of corrupt government leaders in donor countries. The World Bank, the UN and OECD have recognized for cash payment as aid. The money comes directly to the poor and pilots have shown amazing results. So what about Norwegian aid? BN Norway was founded October 2012, and we are affiliate to Basic Income Earth Network, which was founded in 1986. Today we are so fortunate to have one of the founders of BN here with us, Professor Guy Standing. He is Professor of Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, at the University of London, and the author of several books, including The Precariat, The New Dangerous Class. And this book was actually launched here on Globaliseringskonferansen conference earlier today in Norwegian with the name Precariatet. Guy Standing has been involved in the planning and implementation of 3 pilot projects for cash transfer in India and 1 in Namibia. BN Norway is mainly working with spreading the idea of basic income in Norway, but we are also concerned with how we can use Norwegian aid money and perhaps also EEA grants to promote pilot projects and basic income in other countries where Norway is involved. We have invited a number of people here today who are concerned with or do work related to aid. Eva Kløve works in NORAD's evaluation department. She has previously worked as a social policy advisor in NORAD, including focusing on cash transfer. She has a PhD in economics at the ESOP, Department of Economics at the University of Oslo. She is writing about development economics, and part of this is about cash transfer. Ståle Wig is trained as a social anthropologist at the University of Oslo, where he has recently started his PhD studies on the topic of money in international development aid. He also teaches science communication at the University of Oslo and has recently published a biography about the head of the Norwegian Labour Party, Jonas Gahr Støre. He wrote a brilliant commentary on aid and cash transfer, The Friendly Giant, in December 2013. Hilde Opoku is the spokesperson of the Green Party. Opoku has a degree in politics, science, and in the industrial ecology as her specialty, with almost 20 years of experience from civil society work in West Africa. We were supposed to have Remi Nilsen as a okay. Then, at short notice, we are very happy to have Remi Nilsen, editor of the Le Monde Diplomatique, with us as chairman, and he will come soon. So we start the session with Guy Standing. Welcome.
Thank you very much. This is the second time I've spoken this morning, so I have to take off one hat, put on another hat, and instead of speaking about the precariat, speaking about a subject very close to my heart, which is basic income. And I would like to open by making a connection. The connection is this, that the growth of the precariat around the world is symptomatic of a spreading insecurity that people are experiencing. An economic insecurity that is associated with globalization and also with this phenomenal growth of inequality. So in our industrialized countries, the agenda for basic income is becoming clearer, and it's almost reached the point where it's no longer just desirable to move towards a basic income, it's almost essential if we are to provide everybody with a sense of basic security in which to function. But there is a more ethical rationale for a basic income, which I associate with Thomas Paine, with Bertrand Russell, with William Morris, and some of the great philosophers in the past. And it goes something like this: that the wealth and income of every individual in this room and anywhere else is far more due to the efforts and achievements of our predecessors than anything you or I do. But we don't know whose predecessors provided the wealth from which we all benefit. Now, last year I went to an industrial area of England to talk about the precariat, an area called Middlesbrough. Middlesbrough was a little village in 1820, and suddenly they discovered iron ore in the ground. And within 15 years, Middlesbrough had become the center of the Industrial Revolution and the British Empire. So that if you go to San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge was built with iron ore and steel from Middlesbrough. If you go to the other side of the world and you go to see the Sydney Harbour Bridge, it was built with the iron ore and steel of Middlesbrough. If you go to India, and I'm going to be talking about India, the railway lines were mostly built with the iron ore from Middlesbrough. If you go to Middlesbrough today, you see boarded up houses, gardens turned to weeds, blocks of concrete in what were windows. You see people hanging around on street corners, unable to function without any sense of future, without any hope. But if you go down to the south of England, you will find affluent people living off the wealth created by workers in Middlesbrough in the 19th century. And those affluent folk are the same folk who are going into government. They're going to Eton, private schools and privilege, and talking down to the people of Middlesbrough like lords. And you say to yourself, is that justice? Intergenerational justice? Of course not. And the argument for a basic income is that we should be sharing a social dividend from the efforts of our past generation, whether it be in Norway or in Great Britain or any other country. That ethical justification for saying there should be a share of the wealth given to everybody. Because those people down in the south of England don't deserve their affluence. And the people up in the north, in Middlesbrough, don't deserve their insecurity and poverty. So that argument, to me, is a fundamentally important one for saying that ethically we should move to a basic income. Let's deal with the other issues separately. But we also know that people who have basic security, which would come with a basic income, are more altruistic. They are more socially responsible, and the experiments show they work more, not less, contrary to the critics, And when they work, they are more productive, not less. Strong arguments. And it also, in the rich industrialized countries, if you have a basic income, you overcome poverty traps. Because increasingly our governments are moving to means-tested benefits. So you get a benefit only if you prove you are poor, and prove that you are poor not because of your own fault. So they apply means tests and behavior tests, which puts people in the precariat in poverty traps, because if they go from benefits to a low-wage job, they are effectively paying a marginal tax rate of 80% or more, because they are losing the benefits at the same time as they're gaining money income. In Denmark, recent calculations said it was 84%. In other words, they were losing 84%, only getting 16% extra by going into a wage job. This poverty trap situation has become horrendously disincentive towards work and labour. So contrary to some of the critics from the right, a basic income would actually increase the incentives to work and labour, not decrease them. Okay, let me put those issues aside, which I've addressed in a new book which has just come out called The Precariat Charter, which is Article 25, the arguments for a basic income, and come to talk about basic income as a development tool. And what I want to do is say to those who are in the development community, whether it be NORAD or in the case of CEDAR, as I was addressing recently, that foreign aid should be driven by ethical principles, not pragmatic opportunistic principles. And in that regard, I think every social policy should be judged by whether or not it satisfies 5 philosophical principles. The first philosophical principle should be the following. It's the rules, if those of you who are philosophers here, the rules principle, the security difference principle. A policy is socially just if and only if it increases the security of the most insecure groups in society. Follow that? Very important, because a lot of policies do not do that. They may strengthen the middle class, they may strengthen other groups, but they don't strengthen the security of the most insecure. A second principle is what I call the paternalism test principle. No social policy can be acceptable as just if it imposes controls on some groups in society that it doesn't impose on other groups. That means a policy like workfare is fundamentally unjust because it imposes demands on some groups that are not imposed on others. A third principle is the rights, not charity principle. A policy can only be called socially just if it extends the rights of the recipients and loosens the controls exercised by bureaucrats and so on, and turns it into charity. A right is something that is strengthened for the individual who's at the end of the chain, if you like. A fourth ethical principle is the dignified work principle. A policy is only socially just if it promotes the capacity to pursue a life of dignified work, which is not the same as doing coercive labor or low-paid, lousy jobs. It is about giving meaning to the right to work, which is something different. And the fifth, very important policy for those of us on the left, is the ecological constraint principle. No policy can be socially just if it causes pollution and externalities that deplete the environment or the species. And too often, unions have gone along with job promotion schemes that are actually destroying the environment or polluting rivers or something like that. Those policies cannot be acceptable. Now, in terms of social policy, and I've been working on this for many, many years, there are essentially three lines that you can take. You can take the line of subsidized goods, subsidized food, subsidized energy, or whatever you like, subsidies, which tends to be highly inefficient, distort markets, be very ineffective, subject to corruption and so on, and we see this in India in a big way. The second line is the labor line, which is public works, workfare, etc. But you can only get benefits if you perform labor. And I'm going to tell you what labor to do. That line is also very subject to capture by political elites, to corruption, to inefficiency, distortion of markets, driving down wages of other people. It's not a good idea. The third line is the cash line, money. Now, ironically, until about the year 2000, there were no non-contributory cash transfer schemes in operation. I happen to have been, as it was mentioned, a founding member of BIAN, Basic Income. Now it's Earth Network. It was European to start with, but so many people have joined from developing countries. And we have a great network building up in Norway, and I urge all of you to join it, looking at the possibilities of a basic income and how to move in that direction. And in the 1990s, I was invited to Brazil. And the vice president was in the chair, and I was advocating a basic income. And he said to me afterwards, "We can't do this in Brazil. Impossible." But a few brave mayors of small towns set up what became the Bolsa Escolar, which for women with children. All the condition is you had to send your children to school, then you got your monthly basic income. And when President Lula became president, he called a number of us and talked about it, and he was convinced. He wasn't convinced to start. And he launched the Bolsa Familia. And today, more than 60 million Brazilians, in effect, receive a monthly basic income. I had the enormous privilege to have a meeting with him in 2010. I thought it was just going to be a handshake, with the president. And I had a T-shirt on, and he sent people away and sat down, ordered some coffee, and then the photographer took a picture. And he put his arm around me, and I put my arm, I did instinctively, around him. There I was wearing a T-shirt, and he looked presidential and proper. And I felt very embarrassed afterwards with my Brazilian friends. I didn't mean it as an insult. I didn't expect to see the president. But we spent over an hour discussing basic income. And at one point, he tapped the table. And he said, "I know I was only re-elected president because of this policy. I know. And Dilma, who's just been re-elected president, she knows too that if it had not been for this policy, she would no longer be president." I think what's happened in Brazil and what's happened in Mexico with the Progressa scheme that become oportunidades are symbols of a change of thinking. So now more than about 17 Latin American countries have conditional cash transfers. But more and more of the research is showing that the real effect is the cash transfers, not the conditionality. But what we've been doing in India is something I never expected, I may have had a dream that I would do it. But in 2009, after we'd done a small experiment in Namibia of a basic income, a real basic income, I was asked to give a talk to SEWA, Self-Employed Women's Association, which is the biggest union of women in the world. And their leaders have become good friends of mine, but they were a little skeptical politically. But some of the young women leaders from villages came to the meeting I was addressing. I was explaining about basic income, what it meant, what it could do. And at the end, some of the young women stood up and said, why do we not do it in India? Why don't we do an experiment? And that was the start of what I'm about to talk about. Because in 2010, we launched a small pilot with a few hundred families in West Delhi, where everybody was given the choice. You can either continue to receive the subsidized rice, wheat, sugar, and kerosene, or you could have a basic income of the equivalent amount paid to you each month. And we're going to do an experiment to see what happens. About half chose to continue with subsidies, which because people have inertia. Half chose the basic income. And we monitored what happened over the following year. And remarkably, after about 6 months, 1/4 of those who had opted for subsidies came to us and said, we would prefer to have a basic income. And by the end, many more had changed their mind too, because they'd been talking with their neighbors. The second pilot was bigger. In the state of Madhya Pradesh, which I'm about to talk about, which is a big state, we selected 8 villages where every man, every woman, every child individually received a monthly basic income unconditionally, paid in cash as a right. The only condition we attached was that within 3 months they had to open a bank account or a cooperative account so that we could pay the cash into their account. And in order to make it possible, we gave them assistance to how to open a bank account. And to make a long story short, within 3 months, 96% of the villages had bank accounts. So it proved it was possible. And the third pilot, and I'm coming to the results of the second and third in particular in a moment, the third pilot is after we had started this big one, which had 8 villages where everybody received the basic income, and we had control villages of 12 other villages, similar villages, where nobody received a basic income. And what we did was we carried out 4 surveys over 18 months. A baseline, in other words, before anything started, then after 6 months, then after 12 months, and then after 18 months. So the results come from those 4 surveys, plus detailed case studies that were conducted. And the third pilot was a very similar one in a tribal village, where every individual received the basic income, and it was compared with what happened in a similar tribal village somewhere else. Now, it's important to realize what we're talking about. We're talking about something that is universal, regardless of your work status, regardless of your marital status, regardless of your income status, everybody receives it. Because you would say, in reality, you should have taxing back from the wealthy, the consumer tax or whatever other tax. And it's a very small proportion of their income. Whereas for the low income groups, it's a high percentage. So it's a redistributive mechanism automatically. But it proved very important to make it universal because it brought in everybody. Everybody felt that this was their common situation. And what we also did, and this is a unique part of this experiment, is that we said, look, there are two aspects of security. One is income security, and one is voice. Because unless you have access to collective voice, you will remain vulnerable to exploitation and oppression. If you belong to a collective, that voice can act for you. So what we did was we took 4 villages, 4 of the 8 villages where SEWA was operating, and for the other 4 villages where we had a basic income, there was no SEWA operating. And the control villages, 6 of them had SEWA, 6 of them didn't have SEWA. So we're making a contrast with where people had basic income and voice, basic income but no collective voice, and the 2 types without basic income. Very important design feature. If you're going to do an experiment like this, you need to have the design feature. Those of you who are social scientists, basically what we've done is a modified randomized controlled trial that you would do in a medical thing, but you have to do it slightly differently in a social policy experiment. Now let me just tell you a few of the findings. There are many findings. A big report, 500 pages of the findings is about to come out, which has the title which I used, which comes from an English poet, Robert Browning. And it goes, the couplet goes, a little more, how much it is. A little less, what worlds apart. I don't know if that can be translated into Norwegian, but it symbolizes that just a little something can actually have huge effects. And one of the things we have found in this experiment, which really puzzled me, is that although we provided a very modest basic income, which was only about 1/3 of subsistence, so it wasn't a large amount, the effects we've observed were much greater than even I had hoped or expected. That is strange. But there is an emancipatory effect of a basic income, which means that the emancipatory value is greater than the monetary value. I think this is an argument that I've advanced, which is my one claim to have provided a new theory, because I couldn't understand why our effects were so much greater than I expected. Well, first of all, I'm going to use a few slides here and just see if it goes. What we found, effects on basic sanitation. I'm not going to go through it because I won't have time, but I'll just flash up findings on sanitation. The biggest single finding that pleased me was that people started building toilets. Anybody who knows India knows that defecation in the public is widespread, so to build a toilet is a major change in your life. And to see that taking place was quite dramatic. But when it comes to, let's see if I get it right, when it comes to nutrition, I've always said to my Indian friends, and they look at me as if I'm mad, but they know me anyhow, this is when Mozart plays in my ear. When Mozart is playing. Because what we found is that if you take the WHO, World Health Organization, Z-score for children, the Z-score measures the weight for age. What should be the weight of a child for a particular age, right? And it has a normal distribution. And the normal distribution compares with what you expect and find in developing countries, which is that they're on the left. The blue line, wait, get back, don't rush it. The blue line is for boys, and the pink line for girls. When I presented this to CEDA, there was a German woman who jumped up at this point and said, why is this gender bias? Why is it always pink for girls? I said, sorry, but didn't realize. But anyhow, you see that malnutrition is greater for girls than for boys, right? which is what you expect in Indian villages because of discrimination against girls and the treatment of girls. But after just 6 months, by change comes, there it comes. What was dramatic is that the curves in both boys and girls move towards the normal. That green one is what it should be from global perspective. And the girls one improved more than the boys. A dramatic shift, which is something I didn't expect the data to show, but they did show, and we took several ways of observing it, and both ways took place. Other things that I highlight on nutrition, and I'm rushing through that, is that the number of people reporting that their income was adequate for their nutritional needs increased, particularly for the scheduled tribes and scheduled castes. In other words, the lowest income groups in those villages. And you see the blue one where the increase, the cash transfer, where the income improvements was definite. And the village, the tribal village, which shows it through time. So the blue one is their income was sufficient for their food needs. You see sharp increase in the blue, and the green is insufficient, which you'd expect that this declines. The next set of findings relate to health. What we found is those people who received the basic income, individually and as households, had a lower incidence of ill health. So here, for example, the people receiving the basic income, women, 15.5% had illnesses in the 6 months. In the control villages, the villages which didn't have a basic income, in each case, women, elderly, aged, young, and disabled had much higher rates of ill health. Quite a strong finding. And we also found that the basic income people were taking their medicines more regularly and to fruition, to the conclusion of the treatment. And that is a big thing in impoverished areas, because many people, they take a bit of medicine and feel slightly better and then stop because they want to save money. But those people with a basic income were taking their medicines for longer, and therefore it was more effective in curing their problems. And they were spending more on the health care. And I think that something that is given too little attention in social policy debates is that there was a phenomenal improvement for those people with disabilities. In rural low-income areas, people with disabilities tend to be the last to be given any food, the last to go to school, the last to receive any medicine. But now, they had their basic income, just like anybody else. And it empowered them to get treatment, and we have some very telling stories and photos and a film about the disabled. And for me, this was something I had not really expected. We hadn't thought about it enough, but the design of our surveys enabled us to see how great an improvement for the disabled. The next part of the story is on schooling. What happened to schooling? Remember, no conditions. We didn't tell anybody you've got to send your children to school. We didn't do that. It's up to you. We stay out of the villages. We only send independent enumerators to collect the data. We didn't collect the data. And what we found is that there was a sharp improvement in school attendance. On the left, 2 columns are the people who received the basic income. On the right, it's those who didn't. And as you can see, significantly more are in the green columns. That's improvement in attendance of their children in schools. And not only was their attendance improving, but they were spending more on all these aspects. Now, before we started the experiment, Sonia Gandhi, the leader of the Congress Party, told us, what a waste of money. All these people are going to spend it on alcohol and tobacco and useless materials. And at the end, when she heard about the results, she asked us to her house to present these results. And she said, unbelievable, fantastic. We must go in this direction. Unfortunately, by then we knew she was about to lose the general election, which she promptly did. So we're now having to educate a new set of bureaucrats, a new set of people in the new government. But as you can see, spending improved dramatically. What was particularly interesting was that girls, particularly teenage girls, were enrolled in secondary schooling to a much greater extent than before and compared with other villages. If I can get the right slide. This you'll see on the left are the boys, different age groups, and on the right are the girls, with the blue line being the basic income and the red the other. So there's a big increase in enrollment of teenage girls compared with those not receiving the basic income. And there were also things that you don't often pick up in surveys, which included the fact that more of the children were going to school in a bus because their parents or themselves could pay a little for the bus. It's very important for girls in these villages where the vulnerability is incredible, where the rain's coming down, where with all that sort of problem, their parents wouldn't let them go long distances. But the fact was that girls benefited from that sort of change. Now the next set of results, very strong, relates to the emancipatory value of a basic income. Because many villages in India and in many other developing countries, debt bondage is a really big phenomenon. People are in lifetime or even in intergenerational debt bondage, where they were put in debt by a moneylender or a landlord and deliberately kept in debt so that they had to provide labour when and as required by the landlord. In Madhya Pradesh, it's called the Nauka system. And it was wonderful to see a number of people who were Naukas, their families and even some of their friends pooled some of the money to buy them out of their debt bondage. Dramatic emancipation that represents. But we also found that people were reducing their debts and, very, very crucially, were less likely to be relying on short-term, high-interest debts. If you're hit by a crisis suddenly, you suddenly fall ill or your child breaks a leg, you have to borrow at 50% interest because you're desperate. But this liquidity, which they used to keep aside, meant that they were more likely to be able to respond to those crisis points by using their liquidity, by using their basic income. And that was quite a strong effect. So we see debts being reduced, savings being increased, even when people had debts. They used some to save for that crisis point. The next set of findings, and I'm flashing through a whole picture you must understand for brevity, is that earnings, that is earned income, not from the basic income itself, but money and production from work and so on, increased in the basic income villages. So earned income was up. Let's see if I can just give a flashing thing. Here you see this is earned income, so it of course doesn't apply with everybody, but there's a tendency that is important. In the left-hand side, so where the basic income was paid, and where it's not paid is on the right-hand side, and you can see the blue is where increased earned income went up. And of course, there was an increase in the amount of work done by people. And we looked at it in a very original way, I think. And the interesting thing is that not only was there an increase in secondary economic activities, which gives the security, people who have more than one activity earning income, that gives them greater security, obviously, but there was a sharp shift away from casual wage labour to own account activities, producing for yourself, producing as a cooperative in some cases, or producing for individuals. That's freedom. It's important. So you're not at the beck and call of a landlord, you're producing for yourself. And except there was one group where labour went down. Labour went down. Shocking. It was among children. Child labour declined. And interestingly, it was a decline of wage labour among children. Some of the children increased the amount of work they were doing on their farms. But when we asked questions about to the parents, does the work your children are doing disrupt their schooling, it was much less likely to be disruptive when they were working on their own family plot or family business. I regard that as a positive statement. And we also found that, if I can get this right, get back to the picture I put up at the beginning, because most of the villages that received a basic income, it was almost comical. When we went at the beginning, we had photos and film and the rest of it, there were very few animals. When this picture was taken, which was at the end of the pilot, we noticed that there were many more goats, there were many more chicken, there were many more buffaloes. So much so that when I was there earlier this year, in one of the villages, I said, the symbol of our project should be a goat, because that somehow symbolized that they were investing in small assets. The final point I want to make is that the basic income has been a wonderful tool for increasing the status and empowerment of women in these villages. We asked the women that individually at the end and after the end, who benefited more, men or women? And both the men and the women individually said, the women. We asked the same question in a different way about which type of people in your household and in the villages do you think has benefited most? And it was the disabled. Good story. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Remi Nilsen. I'm supposed to chair this meeting. I've been a bit delayed, so I'm coming now. But I would just like to give the word to the next speaker, which is Eva Kløve from the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, NORAD.
Should I sit here or?
As you please.
I wouldn't mind sitting here. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so thank you for inviting me to this panel today. It's a very interesting debate, and Globaliseringskonferansen is somewhere where I feel at home, having started my career, so to speak, in the activist solidarity movement myself. And as I talked about with Greta, I still see myself as an activist and academic and civil servant. So the topic of the day is cash transfers as development aid. There's a lot I could have said about development aid versus development, but I will stay away from that debate now. So the question is, the main question is, should cash transfers have a place in development aid? I think the brief answer to that is yes. for many of the reasons that Guy also pointed to. And as Guy said, cash transfers are fairly recent. And before, many academics and people engaged in development saw it as unaffordable for the poorest countries. And not only that, as Guy pointed to also, there was this expectations that the poor people would just squander away their money. And we've seen with a lot of research up to today that that is certainly not the case. So I think I will not go into all the research that is there on cash transfers and how they work today. Guy took us through a number of positive effects that we have seen in other studies as well. But I wanted to make the point that cash transfers is a lot of different things. Cash transfers is not only universal basic income grants. It can be used in emergency aid, it can be short-term. There are many characteristics of cash transfers that means that it can be very many different things. It can be social insurance, but it can also be emergency aid, like I said. So for me, it's important that cash transfers are integrated into more holistic social policies. And I'm not yet a PhD in economics, but I'm working to get there these very days. But I was affiliated with ESOP, the Center for Equality, Social Organization and Economic Performance, which is Kalle Moenes Center, for those of you who know him, at the University of Oslo. And that research center took up a conundrum that many economists have asked themselves, which is the Nordic countries violate most of the requirements that the economic profession agree would be necessary for a country to prosper. These include too small wage differences, too high and too progressive taxes, too large public sectors, too generous welfare states, and too strong unions. We're sitting in one union building right here. So what most economists would see as a recipe for economic trouble has proved in the Nordic countries to be consistent with just the opposite, with high growth, with low unemployment, low inequality, and a fairly efficient allocation of resources. So why is this? Well, some of the key messages that is coming out of this research center is that certain policies, institutions, and behaviors fit together and strengthen each other. One example is that in the 1960s, increased female labor force participation meant that more women were asking for public care for children and for the elderly. This again meant that more women could work. So welfare and economic development went hand in hand. And I think other than the strong place of social cash transfers in the Nordic model, there are elements of this model that are relevant, I think, for when we speak about social cash transfers. Because, like I said in the beginning, it matters how we do it. Cash transfers are not just cash transfers. For me, it should be integrated in a holistic social policy thinking. And social grants should definitely not be used to fill the gap that the supply side, if you want, that the social services should meet. For example, in South Africa, which is part of what I study in my dissertation, is the child support grant. The child support grant has had many positive outcomes, one of them being increased educational access. But the idea of the government is that primary education should be free for all children. So in fact, this money is spent on filling a gap that should have been provided by the government. And this is why it's important to have more than one thought in the head at the same time. That was a very Norwegian expression. So it's important to see the links. Another point is on the universalism versus targeting, which also Guy somewhat about. Because I think sometimes when we really want to reach the poor people, we get too caught up in how to target them, how to target the poorest and the most vulnerable groups. But there are some who argue that policies for the poor are poor policies. And I think in the Nordic experience, universalism has been a very important principle. And universal systems can be the best way of reaching the poorest. It can also be very important to ensure long-term political support. When the middle class benefit from a program, they're a lot more likely to support it, also financially, and in that way ensuring its sustainability. Also, there are a lot of myths about targeting versus universalism, and especially when it comes to cost. People tend to think that targeted mechanisms are a lot cheaper, but that's not always the case. One thing is that a targeting program is very expensive. You have to know who the poorest of the poor are, you have to know how to find them, identify them, and you have to follow them up, because with such programs with a means test, you have to monitor all the time that they don't go above that means test, which also creates a lot of what we say in economics are perverse incentives. It incentivizes people to stay beyond, below a certain line, and that's certainly not what the intention is. So another thing is that these programs, when targeted, are very vulnerable to inclusion errors. Yeah, and another important point I think we shouldn't underestimate is that people who have a social cash transfer as a right, a universal system, will feel a lot less stigma than if it's a handout, a charity, something that you're given because you're poor. That makes a big difference to anyone, and certainly also to poor people. Predictability is another point that I'm preoccupied with here, because in order to make high risk and high return investments, you have to know that the money is not only there this month, but that it will come again and again and again. You have to trust that this is a system that doesn't go away overnight. So predictability is certainly important. And all of these points really are consistent with a rights-based approach that is in line with Norwegian development policy, although not always followed up in practice, I should say. So the other point is that when you have a rights-based approach in mind, you see people as citizens with a relationship with the state, and universal systems as such can help build a social contract between you as an individual and between the government, which can again have many other positive effects. So I think that NGOs can play a very important role in piloting schemes, but when you know which ones are successful and you want to scale up, then you should make sure that these programs are institutionalized within government structures. Yeah, there was one example from Nicaragua that the program there, which I always tend to pronounce in French because I don't speak Spanish, it's called Dette Protection Sociale. It was stopped when the new politicians came in because it didn't have a place in the constitution. It wasn't constitutionalized as a right, that people had a right to social protection. So it went off with devastating consequences for the poor who had now gotten used to receiving this money. So just a few words on the post-2015 development agenda, because a lot of people, a lot of activists, including people from NORAD, SIDA, Finland, have worked to get social protection as part of the the suggested Sustainable Development Goals that are to follow up from the Millennium Development Goals. So under the first goal, which is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere, no lack of ambitions there, this point 3 under there states that it is a goal to implement nationally appropriate social protection systems and measures for all, including flaws, and by 2030 achieve substantial coverage for the poor and the vulnerable. So it's there, basically. It's also included in the goal on gender equality and the goal on reducing inequality. So to sum up, yes, in principle, to cash transfers, the evidence is very convincing that they have a number of positive effects, but I think they should be part of a holistic social policy thinking. I think there's plenty of leeway in the proposed goals for future development to to lobby for social cash transfers. That is a good opportunity. And finally, don't be shy to draw on Nordic experiences, because this is not to say taking our models and putting them over people's heads, but so much of development comes from one set of institutions, the American institutions. This is what Washington Consensus was built on. This is some of the reasons why we have the Globalization Conference. And this is very much a part of the development agenda even today. So to say that we can learn something from the Nordic countries is not the same as saying we shouldn't take a very local look at what's happening specifically in each situation. But I don't think we should be too shy to say that we have found some solutions that could be interesting also in other parts of the world. Thank you.